The laugh started before Ellie Harper could finish the sentence. You want to plant what? Somebody yelled across the diner. Ellie didn't flinch. Sunflowers, she said. That's when the whole room lost it. One farmer nearly spit coffee across the table. Another guy slapped the counter laughing. Because in Grand Island, Nebraska, men planted corn. Their fathers planted corn. Their grandfathers planted corn. And now a 23-year-old girl was telling a room full of farmers to rip up part of their land and plant flowers instead. Earl Benson laughed the hardest. Earl had been farming for 40 years and talking for 50. Big voice. Red face. The kind of man who thought every problem in America could still be fixed with diesel fuel and common sense. He pointed at Ellie from across the diner. Lloyd, he said, looking at her grandfather, you sent her off to college for 4 years, and she comes back trying to turn your farm into a damn postcard. More laughter. Ellie looked at her grandfather. Lloyd Harper just stared into his coffee like he wanted the floor to open beneath him. That told Ellie everything. He hadn't expected her to say it out loud in public, but she was tired of talking quietly about a problem everybody already knew existed. The South field was failing. Everybody knew it. Yields were dropping. Soil was drying out earlier every summer. Last year, that field barely made enough to justify harvesting it. But around there, men would rather blame weather, Washington, or bad luck before admitting the land itself might need something different. Earl finally stopped laughing long enough to ask, so what's next? Tulips? Maybe throw in some daisies while you're at it. Ellie reached in her bag and pulled out a folded notebook. The South fields lost nearly 20% yield in 7 years, she said. Corn roots aren't reaching moisture deep enough anymore. Sunflowers can. Earl rolled his eyes immediately. There it is. College talk. No, Ellie said. It's math. That quieted the room a little. Not because they agreed with her. Because confidence makes people uncomfortable when it comes from somebody they already decided to underestimate. Earl leaned back in the booth, staring at her now. You really believe this? Ellie nodded once. Yeah, Ido Kropka. Enough to bet your granddaddy's farm on it. Ellie opened her mouth, but Lloyd cut in first. Nobody's betting the farm. Earl looked at him. You better not be. Then he turned back toward Ellie. You know why this is funny? Because every kid who leaves this town for college comes back thinking the old men are stupid. Then real life punches him in the mouth. Ellie didn't answer right away. She looked around the diner instead. Men in seed caps, weather jackets, coffee mugs. Half of them looked amused. The other half looked irritated. But almost all of them looked tired. Farming had been getting harder for years. Everybody felt it. Nobody liked saying it out loud. Ellie finally looked back at Earl. You know what's funny to me? She asked. Earl smirked. What? Watching yields drop every year while everybody pretends nothing's changing. The smile faded off his face a little. Lloyd sighed under his breath. He hated where this conversation was going. Earl folded his arms. Corn built this county. Yeah, Ellie said. And now half the farms around here are buried in debt, trying to force the same ground to keep producing like it's 1985. That one hit harder. A farmer near the counter slowly lowered his coffee mug. Another guy stopped eating entirely. Earl pointed at her notebook. You trust those papers too much. Ellie shook her head. I trust what I've been seeing since I was 16. That wasn't a lie. She'd been helping on the farm since high school, running grain carts during harvest, walking fields with Lloyd, checking irrigation, watching the South field struggle worse every season while everybody kept planting the exact same crop into the exact same dirt, hoping somehow this year would magically fix it. It never did. Lloyd finally looked at her. Ellie. She turned toward him. What? That's enough. Earl smirked again. No, let her talk. I want to hear how flowers are going to save Nebraska. Ellie ignored the joke. Sunflowers use less water, lower input costs, better drought tolerance. The Dakotas have been growing them for years. This ain't the Dakotas. Drought doesn't care what state you're in. Earl shook his head, laughing softly now instead of loudly. You really think you figured something out nobody else did? Ellie looked him dead in the eye. I think most people are too scared to try. That did it. The room went completely quiet. Earl's expression changed first. The joking disappeared. Not because she insulted him, because deep down he understood exactly what she meant. Farmers survive by avoiding risk, especially older ones. If something worked for 30 years, you kept doing it until the wheels came off completely. Lloyd rubbed his forehead slowly. He looked exhausted. Finally, Earl asked the question everybody in the diner wanted answered. So, how much land you planning to waste on this? Ellie answered immediately. 30 acres. Lloyd almost choked on his coffee. Absolutely not. Ellie turned him fast. 20 then. No. 15. Lloyd shook his head harder now. Earl laughed under his breath, watching the negotiation happen in real time. Finally, Lloyd muttered 10. Ellie blinked. 10. South edge near the creek. Earl burst out laughing again. Hell, even the weeds don't like that part of your farm. But Ellie knew exactly why Lloyd picked it. Because it was the worst producing ground they had. If she failed there, nobody would care. Lloyd pointed a finger at her across the table. You pay for the seed yourself. Fine punto. You handle the market. Already started. That caught him off guard. What? I've already talked to 2 buyers in Kansas. Now, even Earl stopped smiling for a second. Lloyd stared at her differently after that. Not impressed exactly. More like unsettled. Because this suddenly sounded less like a kid chasing an idea and more like somebody who'd been planning this for a while. And she had been. What nobody in that diner knew yet was that Ellie found the farm's loan renewal papers sitting open on the kitchen table 3 months earlier. She wasn't snooping. Lloyd forgot to put them away. But she saw enough. Rising interest. Tight margins. Late equipment payments. The Harper farm wasn't dying. Not yet. But another bad harvest could change that fast. Lloyd never talked about money trouble. Men his age usually didn't. Pride got in the way. But Ellie understood something he didn't want to admit yet. Corn wasn't saving them anymore. It was barely keeping them alive. Earl finally stood up and grabbed his cap. Well, he said, this'll be entertaining at least. A few men laughed again, but not as hard as before, because now the idea was sitting in the room with them. Real enough to make people uncomfortable. Earl stopped beside Lloyd before leaving. You let this girl plant flowers on your land, he said quietly. Folks are going to think you lost your damn mind. Lloyd stared into his coffee for a long moment before answering. Maybe. Then he stood up slowly and looked at Ellie. You get 1 season. Ellie nodded once. That's all I need. And that was before the drought started. By the next morning, half the county already knew about the diner conversation. That was how farming towns worked. News traveled faster than rain. Ellie noticed it before breakfast was even over. A pickup slowed down near the mailbox, then kept driving. An hour later, another truck rolled past the south field, so slowly the driver nearly dropped a tire into the ditch staring at her. Lloyd noticed too. He just pretended not to. Around noon, their neighbor Hank Miller stopped by the machine shed, holding a coffee thermos like he had some casual reason for being there. He didn't. Heard you're planting sunflowers, Hank said. Lloyd kept tightening a bolt on the combine header. Heard wrong. Hank glanced toward Ellie. That's so. Lloyd wiped grease off his hands slowly. She's planting sunflowers. Hank laughed once through his nose. Well, guess technically that means I heard right. Ellie was sitting on an overturned bucket nearby, going through seed catalogs. Hank looked at her like people look at somebody who just announced they're building a rocket in their garage. You serious about this? He asked. Ellie nodded. Yeah. Hank stared a second longer before shaking his head. College. Then he walked back to his truck, smiling to himself. Ellie waited until he drove off before speaking. You know I'm right. Lloyd kept working without looking at her. That's the problem. Ellie frowned. What does that mean? Lloyd finally straightened up. Means if this works, every man in this county is going to have to admit a 23-year-old girl saw something they didn't. Ellie almost smiled. That sounds more like their problem. No, joy de mater. That becomes my problem too. He walked back into his shed before she could answer. But Ellie understood exactly what he meant. Pride mattered in farming towns. Reputation mattered. Men like Lloyd survived hard years by looking steady even when things weren't steady at all. You didn't tell neighbors you were worried. You didn't admit your fields were struggling. And you definitely didn't let your granddaughter come back from college and tell everybody the old way wasn't working anymore. But the truth was, Ellie hadn't come home trying to prove anybody wrong. She came home because she got scared. It started during her final semester at the University of Nebraska. One of her professors showed rainfall data from central Nebraska over the last 15 years. Less consistent rain, longer dry stretches, higher summer heat. Ellie remembered staring at those charts, thinking about the Harper farm immediately, especially the south field, because she knew that field better than anybody her age probably should. She drove tractors there at 14, picked rocks there at 12, rode beside her grandfather during harvest every fall since middle school, and she watched the same thing happen year after year. Corn came up weaker, soil dried faster, inputs got more expensive. Every season took more money just to produce less grain. Nobody called it failure. Farmers never do. They call it a rough year. Then another rough year comes. Then another. Then eventually rough years become normal. That scared Ellie more than droughts did. One night during college, she called Lloyd after checking market prices. "How bad is the operating loan?" she asked him. Long silence. Then, "Don't worry about grown folks' business." That told her enough. After graduation, she could have taken a job in Lincoln. Good salary. AG consulting company. Air conditioning. Weekends off. Instead, she came back home because she knew something Lloyd didn't want to admit yet. The farm was surviving, but it had stopped moving forward years ago. And survival gets dangerous when the margins keep shrinking. 3 days after the diner incident, Ellie drove 2 hours west to meet a sunflower grower named Tom Ridley near Holdridge. Tom had been planting oilseed sunflowers for almost a decade. Most farmers around Grand Island treated him like a lunatic too at first. Then a drought hit back in 2012, and his fields outperformed half the county. Funny how success changes people's opinions. Tom walked Ellie through one of his storage buildings while she took notes. "Biggest mistake beginners make," he said, "thinking sunflowers behave like corn. They don't." Ellie nodded. "What's the hardest part?" "The first year." "Why?" Tom laughed. "Because everybody wants you to fail." That stayed with her the whole drive home, especially because she already knew it was true. Back at the Harper farm, Lloyd was sitting at the kitchen table staring at bills when she walked in. He folded the papers up fast. Too fast. Ellie pretended not to notice. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Good. You buy seed?" "Not yet." Lloyd nodded slowly. "Good." Ellie narrowed her eyes. "Why is that good?" Lloyd leaned back in his chair. "Means you still got time to come to your senses." Ellie dropped her notebook on the table. "You gave me the acres. 10 acres. That's all I asked for." Lloyd studied her face for a second. "You really believe this is going to save the farm?" Ellie answered honestly. "I think it gives us a better chance than pretending things are fine." Lloyd looked away after that. That answer hit too close to something he'd been trying not to think about. The next week got worse. Not financially. Socially. Ellie became a joke around town. Somebody taped a fake sunflower to the bulletin board outside the co-op with Harper Flower Farm written underneath it. Earl Benson started calling her Daisy May every time he saw her. A cashier at the feed store asked if she planned on selling bouquets at the farmer's market. Most people thought it was funny. Ellie laughed some of it off, but not all of it. One evening, she finally snapped after dinner. "You know what the worst part is?" she asked Lloyd. He kept eating quietly. "They're not even arguing with the numbers." "Nope. They're laughing because they already decided I'm too young to know what I'm talking about." Lloyd chewed slowly before answering. "That's usually how age works." Ellie shook her head. "No, that's ego." Lloyd set his fork down. "You think farming's about being smart?" Ellie frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Means I've seen smarter men than you lose farms because they thought numbers mattered more than instinct." Ellie crossed her arms. "And I've seen stubborn men keep doing the same thing until the bank took everything." That ended dinner early. Lloyd walked outside without another word. Ellie immediately regretted saying it. Not because it wasn't true, because she knew exactly where it hit him. Lloyd's older brother lost his farm during the 1980s collapse. Ellie remembered hearing the adults whisper about it when she was little. Debt, bad commodity prices, foreclosure. Her uncle never really recovered from emotionally. Neither did Lloyd. An hour later, Ellie found him sitting alone in the machine shed staring at the old combine. "I shouldn't have said that," she admitted quietly. Lloyd nodded once. "No, you shouldn't have." Ellie sat beside him on an overturned bucket. "But I'm not wrong either." Lloyd stared out toward the dark fields. That's the part one can't decide. That was the first honest thing he'd said about it in weeks. Ellie looked at him carefully. You think I might be right? Lloyd sighed heavily. I think this farm's changing whether I like it or not. They sat there quietly for a minute. Then Lloyd finally asked the question he'd been avoiding since the diner. What if this fails? Ellie answered immediately. Then I fail. Lloyd shook his head. No, if this fails, they'll say I was stupid enough to let it happen. Ellie didn't respond right away because she realized something important then. This wasn't really about crops anymore. It was about fear. Lloyd wasn't afraid of losing 10 acres. He was afraid of being the old man who stopped trusting everything he'd believed his whole life. And if Ellie was right, then men like Earl Benson weren't laughing because sunflowers sounded ridiculous. They were laughing because deep down they were terrified the young girl might actually be seeing the future before they did. And that was before the first seed even went into the ground. Ellie planted the sunflower seeds on a cold Thursday morning in late April while 3 pickup trucks sat parked along the county road, watching her like she was setting fire to the farm. Nobody even tried hiding it anymore. Every farmer around Grand Island knew exactly what day she was planting. Earl Benson drove past twice before noon. The second time, he slowed down enough to roll his window down and yell, "Still time to stop embarrassing your granddad." Ellie ignored him and kept driving the planter. Lloyd watched the whole thing from beside the machine shed with his arms crossed tight. He hated the attention almost as much as he hated the idea itself. But he said nothing. 10 acres. That was the deal. 10 acres on the worst part of the Harper farm. If it failed, everybody would laugh and move on. But Ellie noticed something important that week. The laughter sounded different now, less confident, because mocking somebody is easy before money gets involved. But planting season had already started badly that year. Rain came late. Fuel prices jumped again, and corn futures dropped almost 8% in 2 weeks. Farmers around town were already nervous whether they admitted it or not. Ellie finished planting just before dark. Lloyd walked over while she was cleaning dirt off her gloves. Well, he muttered, staring out at the field. Too late now. Ellie smiled slightly. Yep. Lloyd shook his head slowly. Looks wrong. Different always looks wrong at first. He didn't answer that. But 2 days later, he walked the sunflower field alone before breakfast. Ellie saw his boot tracks in the dirt. By May, the jokes got worse. Somebody left a packet of birdseed in the Harper's mailbox. Earl Benson started calling the south field Ellie's garden. Even people who liked Lloyd were quietly telling him he should have shut the whole thing down before it became town gossip. One night at Murphy's Diner, a farmer named Curtis Doyle sat beside Lloyd and asked, "You really trusting your whole operation to a college kid?" Lloyd answered without looking up from his coffee. "It's 10 acres. Curtis smirked. That's how bad ideas start. But here's the thing nobody saw coming. The sunflowers came up fast. Faster than expected. Strong. Even rows. Thick stands. Ellie noticed it first. Then Lloyd noticed. Then the neighbors noticed. Corn around the county was struggling already because the rain still wasn't coming consistently. Some fields looked uneven before June even started. But the sunflower fields stayed dark green. Healthy. Alive. One evening, Lloyd stood beside Ellie at the edge of the field, just staring at it quietly. "Looks better than I expected," he admitted. Ellie tried not to smile too hard. "It's rooting deeper already." Lloyd nodded slowly. "Maybe, but farming has a way of punishing people the second they start feeling confident." 3 weeks later, a windstorm ripped across central Nebraska, hard enough to flatten irrigation rigs and tear branches off windbreak trees. Ellie woke up around midnight to the sound of metal banging outside. By morning, part of the sunflower field was leaning badly east. Lloyd walked through the damage, shaking his head. "There it is," he muttered. "What?" Ellie asked. "The part where nature reminds you who's in charge." Ellie crouched beside one of the damaged rows, checking the stalks carefully. "They'll recover." Lloyd looked doubtful. "Corn wouldn't." "These aren't corn." But the storm wasn't even the real problem. The real problem showed up 2 weeks later when Ellie got a call from one of the Kansas buyers she'd lined up. "We've got an issue," the buyer told her. "What kind of issue?" "Storage capacity's tighter than we thought." Ellie felt her stomach drop immediately. "You said you could take the crop." We still might. But I can't guarantee volume now. Might. Long silence. A lot of growers expanded acreage this season. Ellie hung up and sat in silence for almost 10 minutes. That was the first moment she genuinely felt scared, because Earl Benson had been right about one thing. Growing something different means every problem is yours alone. Corn had infrastructure, buyers, elevators, insurance systems. Everybody understood corn. Nobody around there understood sunflowers. That night, Lloyd found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at market reports. "What happened?" he asked immediately. Ellie told him. Lloyd listened quietly the whole time. Then he leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath through his nose. "This," he said, "is exactly why farmers stick with what works." Ellie rubbed her forehead. "I know. You could grow the best crop in the county. Doesn't matter if nobody buys it." Ellie didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, she started making calls before sunrise. Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, anybody processing oilseed sunflower. Most said the same thing. Maybe. Depends on volume. Depends on timing. Depends on freight. Ellie started realizing something important. She hadn't just planted crop. She'd accidentally declared war on an entire system built around corn. Meanwhile, the weather kept getting worse. By early July, the drought officially hit central Nebraska. No meaningful rain in weeks. Temperatures over 100 degrees. Corn leaves around the county started curling by mid-morning. Irrigation pumps ran nonstop. Diesel costs exploded. Farmers got quieter. Murphy's Diner sounded different now. Less joking. More staring at weather forecasts. One afternoon, Earl Benson drove out to check one of his cornfields and found half the outer rows already burning up. That scared him bad enough, he stopped by the Harper farm on the way home. Ellie saw his truck pull in and immediately knew something was wrong, because Earl Benson never visited people unless he wanted something. He climbed out slowly, looked toward the sunflower field, then looked away fast like he didn't want anybody catching him studying it too long. Lloyd met him near the shed. "Everything all right?" Earl shrugged. "Depends what you mean by all right." Lloyd nodded toward the road. "Your corn." Earl stayed quiet a second too long. That told them enough. Finally, he looked toward Ellie. "Your flowers still hanging in there?" Ellie answered carefully. "So far." Earl walked toward the field edge slowly. The sunflowers weren't huge yet, but they were standing stronger than almost anything else around them. Earl crouched beside one row and dug his fingers into the dirt. Dry on top, damp underneath. His expression changed slightly. "Elle," he muttered under his breath. Ellie noticed Lloyd watching Earl very carefully then, because for the first time since all this started, nobody was laughing anymore. Earl stood back up. "Still too early," he said quickly. "Crop ain't made yet." Then he got back in his truck and left. But the confidence was gone. A week later, things got worse across the county. Heat wave. No rain. Corn yields started collapsing fast. Some fields looked dead by afternoon. Farmers who mocked Ellie 2 months earlier suddenly stopped making jokes altogether, because now they were busy calculating losses. One night, Lloyd sat at the kitchen table going through crop estimates while the local weather report played softly in the background. "This keeps up," he muttered. "Half the county's getting buried this year." Ellie looked over at him carefully. "The sunflowers are still holding." Lloyd nodded slowly. Then he said something Ellie never expected to hear. "I know." Long silence after that. Then Lloyd looked out the kitchen window toward the south field and quietly added, "I think everybody else knows too." And that was the moment everything started changing. By August, nobody in Clay County was laughing anymore. The drought got too bad. Cornfields across Nebraska started dying fast. Leaves curled by noon. Whole sections turned yellow before harvest even arrived. Farmers stopped joking at Murphy's Diner because everybody was busy figuring out how much money they were about to lose. But Ellie's sunflower field was still standing. Not perfect, not huge, but alive. And people noticed. Earl Benson noticed too. One morning, he drove out to the Harper farm before sunrise. No jokes this time. No ismierk. He stood beside the field for almost a minute before finally asking, "How deep do these roots go?" Ellie looked at him carefully. "Deeper than corn." Earl nodded slowly. Then he asked the question he never thought he'd ask. You think this could work on my west quarter? That was the moment everything changed. Because Earl Benson was the same man who laughed at her in the diner. Now he was asking for help. Word spread fast after that. More farmers started showing up at the Harper farm pretending they were just curious. One wanted to know where Ellie bought seed. Another asked about water usage. Another spent 20 minutes digging into the soil beside the sunflowers without saying a word. The county wasn't laughing anymore. Now, they were watching. But Ellie still had problems. The buyers in Kansas kept hesitating. Freight costs were climbing. Storage was tight. One bad deal could still ruin everything. One night, Ellie sat at the kitchen table staring at numbers when Lloyd walked in. "Still worried?" he asked. Ellie nodded. "If nobody buys the crop, none of this matters." Lloyd stayed quiet a second. Then he said something she never expected to hear. "No, you already proved your point." Ellie looked up at him. Lloyd nodded toward the field outside. That ground held when everybody else has failed. That meant more to Ellie than he realized, because it was the first time Lloyd admitted she'd been right from the beginning. Then harvest arrived, and things got ugly fast across the county. Some cornfields produced half their normal yields. Some farmers chopped entire sections for feed because harvesting wasn't worth the fuel cost. Lloyd ran the combine through one of their cornfields, stared at the monitor numbers for a long time, then shut the machine off completely. "I've never seen it this bad," he muttered. But the sunflower field made money. Real money. Not miracle money, but enough to carry a huge part of the farm through the worst season they'd had in years. That night, Lloyd sat at the kitchen table doing the numbers over and over himself. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and looked at Ellie. "Without those 10 acres, he said quietly, "we'd be in serious trouble right now." Ellie didn't say anything. Lloyd looked down at the papers again and shook his head slowly. "Whole county laughed at you." Then he looked back up. "Turns out you were the only one paying attention." And after that, nobody in town called it Ellie's flower field anymore. The next spring, Earl Benson planted 40 acres of sunflowers on his west quarter. He never announced it, never admitted Ellie inspired him. He just did it quietly and acted like it had always been his idea. That's how pride works in small farming towns. But people noticed. Then another farmer tried it. Then another. By the end of the year, 6 farms around Clay County had added sunflowers or drought-resistant rotation crops to at least part of their land. And every single one of them had the same reason, even if they didn't say it out loud. They watched Ellie Harper survive the worst drought in years while everybody else struggled just to stay afloat. Murphy's Diner changed too. Funny how fast respect replaces laughter when money gets involved. Men who barely looked at Ellie a year earlier now slid into booths beside her asking questions about seed costs and soil depth. One farmer even brought a notebook. Earl Benson still refused to apologize directly, but one morning he handed Ellie a cup of coffee and said, "Your numbers on water retention, they were right." For Earl, that was basically a public confession. Lloyd enjoyed that part more than he admitted. He still acted grumpy most days, but something about him changed after the harvest. He stopped introducing Ellie as my granddaughter home from college. Now he introduced her as the one running the South Field. That meant something, especially coming from him. By the second year, the Harper farm looked different. Not richer, not flashy, just steadier, smarter. Ellie expanded the sunflower acreage carefully while rotating part of the weaker ground out of corn completely. Input costs dropped. Soil conditions improved. And for the first time in years, Lloyd stopped staring at bills late at night after supper. But the biggest moment came during the county agriculture meeting that winter. The extension office invited Ellie to speak about drought-resistant rotation crops. She almost said no at first. Public speaking wasn't really her thing. But Lloyd surprised her again. "You should do it," he said. "Why?" Lloyd shrugged. "Might help somebody avoid making the same mistakes we did." So Ellie stood in front of nearly 80 farmers inside a high school gymnasium 3 months later, holding the same kind of notebook people once laughed at a Murphy's Diner. Only this time nobody was laughing. She talked about root depth, water retention, soil fatigue, diversification. She explained how the South Field had been warning them for years before anybody wanted to admit it. Most importantly, she said something that made the entire room go quiet. "The lesson isn't that sunflowers are better than corn," Ellie said. "The The lesson is that doing the same thing forever just because it worked before can eventually bury you. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. A few older farmers just stared down at the floor because deep down they knew exactly what she meant. Then Ellie looked around the room and added one more thing. Most farms don't fail all at once. They fail slowly, one rough season at a time, while everybody keeps pretending next year will magically fix it. That one hit hard, because every man in that room had lived through at least one season like that already. After the meeting ended, farmers lined up to talk to her. Not because she was famous, not because she was special, because she'd been right when nobody wanted her to be. Earl Benson waited until almost everybody left before finally walking over. He stood there awkwardly for a second with both hands in his jacket pockets. "You know," he muttered, "I was pretty hard on you." Ellie smiled slightly. "Little bit." Earl nodded once. "Didn't think a kid could teach me much about farming." Ellie crossed her arms. "And now?" Earl looked down at the floor, then back up at her. "Now I think maybe farming changes faster than farmers do." Ellie laughed softly. "That might be true." Earl pointed at her notebook. "Still hate those damn charts, though." Then he walked away before she could answer. Lloyd had been standing near the back wall, watching the whole conversation happen. On the drive home, he stayed quiet for a long time before finally speaking. "Your grandma would have loved this." Ellie smiled, looking out the truck window. "You think so?" Lloyd nodded. "She always said you got your stubbornness from me and your brains from everybody else." Ellie laughed hard enough. Lloyd finally did too. And for the first time in a long while, the Harper farm didn't feel like a place barely hanging on anymore. It felt like a future again. Years later, people around Clay County would still talk about the drought season when the corn failed and Ellie Harper's sunflower field stayed standing. Some people exaggerated the story over time. Others acted like they believed in her from the beginning. That part always made Lloyd laugh. But the truth was simpler than all that. Ellie Harper never set out to prove old farmers were stupid. She just noticed something changing before everybody else was ready to admit it. And she was brave enough to say it out loud. "Late summer light." "Funny thing," he muttered. Ellie looked over. "What?" Lloyd smiled faintly without taking his eyes off the field. "Whole county thought you were planting flowers." Ellie laughed softly. "Yeah." Lloyd nodded toward the field. "Turns out you were planting thyme."